Hello, everyone, and welcome to our webinar, Supporting Students' Academic Language Development with the Science of Reading. My name is Lauren Brenner, and I'm on the marketing team at Amplify. And our guest speaker today is the host of Amplify Science of Reading the podcast. Next month, we'll be releasing Season 10 of the podcast, all about reading comprehension. So be sure to subscribe today so you don't miss an episode. Season 10 launches September 10th. And we'll also drop the link to the podcast in our chat here. And now I'm thrilled to continue my introduction of our special guest speaker we have with us today. Dr. Susan Lambert is our Chief Academic Officer of Literacy at Amplify and the host of Science of Reading the podcast. Throughout her career, she has focused on creating high-quality learning environments using evidence-based practices. And as host of the podcast, she explores the increasing body of scientific research and how reading is best taught. She's a former classroom teacher, administrator, and curriculum developer. And she's dedicated to turning theory into best practices that educators can put right to use in the classroom and to showcasing national models of reading instruction. We are so lucky to have Susan with us today. And without further ado, Susan, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Lauren. Thanks for that great introduction. And hello from me in Michigan. I'm in Grand Rapids, Michigan, and I'm watching the chat. It looks like people all around the world. How exciting that is. I'm really curious. I wish we would have put in the poll. How many of you are teachers of something other than English language arts? Because what we're going to be talking about today is actually relevant to all content areas. So I'm excited to jump in. So today we're going to talk about supporting students' academic language development. We're going to unpack what academic language development is. And our goals for today is to deepen our understanding of language. We're going to try to describe this connection between language and literacy. Like I said, we're going to examine and unpack this concept of academic language, and I'm going to leave you with a bit of a challenge. If we were in person, we would be doing lots of things that are interactive, and we are actually going to try to do that today too, so bear with me. So the first thing that I want you to think about is I want you to think about what is language. Now, don't do anything yet except for think. And awkwardly, I'm actually going to give you 1 minute of think time. And so what I want you to do is just what the slide says. If you can, in 3 words, whether they're related or whether they're different words, think of 3 words that would help describe language. Just think now, and I'll give you about a minute. We're about halfway there, so you have 30 more seconds. Keep thinking. And in just a few seconds here, I'm going to have you throw it into the chat, which people are already doing. So go ahead and throw in the chat what 3 words you came up with for language. Communication, thoughts, culture, expression, sounds. Oh, it's going by so fast. Lots of communications, lots of spoken words, linguistics, verbal or nonverbal communication. This is amazing. Oracy, semantics, syntax. Receptive communication, I saw in there. Well, they're going by so fast, I can't read them all. Knowledge, ways to relay information. This is amazing. You know, one of the hardest things that I think I have ever asked participants to do in a professional development session is to try to write a definition for language. And it's harder than you think. It's one of those words that we probably use often, but to understand really the depth of what language is, it's not that easy to sort of describe. So we're going to look at that a little bit. You know, one of my favorite things to do, of course, is to ask Google for definitions. So this is the Google definition of language. And number 1, I think most of us said, the principal method of human communication consisting of words used in a structured and conventional way and conveyed by speech, writing, or gesture. So this idea of verbal or nonverbal. But there's others, there's other definitions here too. Definition number 2 talks about symbols and rules for writing programs or algorithms. So language is not just what we read in a book, but it's also what we think of when we think of technology and learning how to code, right? And so language is really a very broad topic, and also very important to developing as as informed people and citizens and humans. So we're going to talk a little bit about modes of language because these two modes of language are going to be important to us as we think about academic language. And most of you probably know this as a great reminder. If you've been with me on other presentations, I often talk about this. We have this idea of oral language, which involves listening and speaking, and written language, which involves reading and writing. And if you're an English language arts teacher here in the United States and you understand how we need to incorporate standards into what happens in our classroom, you can sort of see this listening and speaking, reading and writing, and recognize them as some of the domains that are within our ELA standards. I'm going to challenge us a little bit, though, because these modes of language, both oral and written language, are important no matter what content area you're in. And we're going to specifically talk about that when we talk about the idea of academic language. So let's unpack language just a little bit. I saw some of these words that you came up with in the chat. This idea of oral language and written language, you can see those two boxes there on the left of your screen. Some of you talked a little bit about receptive language. That's the language we take in, and expressive language, that's the language that actually goes out. And so these things don't develop at the same time or in quite the same way. Oral language is a naturally developing process. What I mean by that is babies are born to communicate. And as a matter of fact, before they're even born, they hear sounds around them. So third trimester or so, babies are already taking in the language that they hear around them and doing a lot of listening. And when they're first born, they're born into an environment where they're listening to the sounds and the language, the words, the rhythm of the language, the syntax of the language around them. And it takes a while before they actually start to then express that language. So they start speaking, and when they first start speaking, we all know that it comes in sort of fits and starts. They don't start speaking in full sentences with using all the vocabulary they hear around them. But they do start small and steady and continue to gain. That's how they then push that language back out. First, they're sort of imitating, and then they start to put things together to really communicate meaning. Again, this is a process that we are naturally built for, to listen and to speak. And it's something that we have to leverage. And we'll talk about leveraging that as we develop academic language. We then have written language. So written language, obviously the receptive area of written language is reading. So how do we then take in information through the reading process? And then how do we communicate information then through the writing process? Written language is not naturally developing. This is the area that must be explicitly taught. So even if you put a child in a room full of books with people reading and reading to them and modeling the writing process, they're not necessarily going to learn how to read. As a matter of fact, we need to make sure that they have explicit instruction to be able to read and write. But what I want you to notice on this slide is the listening, speaking, reading, and writing are all elements of language. They're modes of language. And it's really important that we're leveraging each one of those in different ways. So let's think about oral language and written language and how they compare. We've talked a little bit about it, but we'll do this sort of bullet point by bullet point. Again, oral language develops naturally. That's the thing that we don't have to necessarily explicitly teach. And it's typically more informal. How I'm talking to you right now, believe it or not, is a little more informal than if I wrote this up in a paper or submitted an article. Oral language also uses extra cues, body language. You can even see me as I'm talking. I use my hands a lot, right? Or I change my tone, and that helps with the communication. Oral language also relies on synchronous interactions. Even though the two of us aren't talking back and forth, if we were face to face and in person, I could say something and you could respond and I could build on that. And if you weren't quite understanding, you could say, I'm not quite understanding. And so we could go back and forth in a synchronous interaction to ensure that we were communicating appropriately. It's also, by the way, oral language less precise. I don't have to use precision in my words because I can leverage body language or tone, or you can ask me questions so to make sure that there's clarity. So that's all about oral language. Well, what about written language? Again, written language must be taught. Some say that writing is the greatest technology that was ever developed, but it's also a technology, right? It is not something that is universal, like we don't all write the same way. And so we have to be taught about how those sounds and words are represented in print. Written language is also much more formal and tends to be more complex. So even if you pick up a children's picture book, which by the way has very complex sentences in it many times, you can see that how you read that text is very different than how we would write that text. And that's why it's super important for our youngest of learners, even those right when they're born, before they're born, that you read to them so that they get exposure to that complex language. Written language uses things in print like headings and layouts and images and punctuation that helps communicate the message. So the author uses those ways in really interesting ways in order to communicate the message, depending on the genre in which they're writing, the purpose for which they're writing. And so this sort of is like extra cues in body language, but it's extra cues that the author gives in print. Written language relies on asynchronous interactions. So the author who writes this can't be there with the reader when the reader is actually reading their text. And so because of that, authors need to be much more precise in terms of their communication. And you often notice, the syntax is much more complicated. You read through paragraphs that are sort of hang together as a paragraph much differently than if you're speaking and can go back and forth. We're going to come back to that in a few minutes, but just pointing out the differences between oral and written language. Now, when we think about the science of reading, you would probably be surprised if I didn't talk about the simple view of reading. I use this framework often. And it's really important for us to ground ourselves in this framework as we think about then what it takes for skilled reading. And I would say also writing too. This framework isn't just related to English language arts development. This framework can be used broadly to think about a couple of things. So first of all, when we think about both word recognition and language comprehension, they are both elements of language. So let's think about that in a holistic way. But I want to review this a little bit because we want to look at the link between language and literacy. And it's really important that we use a model such as the simple view of reading to do that. And essentially, you've heard me talk about it before, you hear others talk about it. Essentially, what this tells us is that skilled reading requires two cognitive capacities. That is the ability to recognize words on the page and the ability to comprehend the meaning that's on that page. And if we know that the authors of this framework or the developers of this framework said, no, it's not just about decoding. It is about lifting the words or decoding the words on the page and actually understanding what they mean. We also know this framework, Scarborough's rope, or the elements of early reading. And the reason why I want to unpack this just a little bit before we get into academic language is as a reminder. So, I always say this white part underneath the title of this slide, and before we actually look at the reading rope, is white. And I should put something in there because oral language is really important to the development of both of these things. So oral language is critical for both word recognition as students start to understand how sounds are represented by letters and combinations of letters and how those are put together to form words. And oral language is really critical when we start to think about the knowledge that students are exposed to before they come to school, the vocabulary they're exposed to, the sentence structures they're exposed to, and how we can help them build that mental model. So you know that before a student comes into kindergarten or pre-K, what they bring with them is very important to how this literacy develops or how we developed in terms of skilled reading. And one other thing that I want to comment on here is that the lower part of the rope, this word recognition stuff, we need to get kids automatic in recognizing the words on the page so they don't have to use that cognitive energy anymore, so that they can apply that cognitive energy into understanding the language or understanding the words on the page, how those words are put together, and the messages the text are attempting to communicate. I often use an analogy of word recognition and the process of becoming automatic is like driving a car, right? So when you first learn how to drive, you have to think about everything you do. You have to think about buckling your seatbelt. You have to think about putting the car in reverse. You have to think about using your mirrors or your backup camera to back up. And once you get really automatic at that, you don't have to think about those things anymore. You just get in the car and you do the things that you need to do so that your energy can be put towards making sure you're getting to the right place or watching the traffic around you. So it's very similar. Okay. Again, I like to use those two frameworks to always go back and ground ourselves. Now, there's many more frameworks we could use, but those two are really, really helpful in terms of thinking about access to academic language, which we'll get to. So here's what I want you to think about. You can put this right in the chat if you want to. How are language then and literacy related? If we talk about these two frameworks as being frameworks to literacy, how is what we're talking about with language related to literacy? So anybody that wants to start putting something in the chat, please give us a response. Anybody want to help us with that? Maybe I got you thinking a little bit. How are language and literacy related? The more language you understand, the bigger boost to literacy. Great. Direct correlation. Without language, we would not have literacy. I love that. Language sets the foundation for literacy development. Language is the foundation to literacy. Look at you all. You have this, right? Literacy is actually a secondary system. We build this process of literacy, and it's dependent on language as the primary system. And we're going to unpack that in a minute. Language is our primary system. And it says here, effective teachers of reading know a good deal about language. I might say that effective teachers know a good deal about language. And I'll show you in a minute why they say that. So, what is language? What are the domains of language? We could take a whole hour to unpack all of these, but know that there's phonology, or the sound parts of the language. When we think about this is we're dealing with the word recognition, so how we read and write words. We also think about morphology, or the meaning parts of words and language. We think about syntax, how you construct sentences, and the complexity of those sentences, both to understand an author's meaning, but also to communicate meaning. We talk about semantics, or the meaning system of a language. Pragmatics, the use of a language. So how I'm talking to you right now is not the same way I'm going to be talking to my daughter later today, who's getting ready to get married. How exciting. And then we talk about orthography, which is our system of writing a language. So it's really important that we, at some level, whatever we happen to have a subject matter in, is that we understand these elements of language, because all of them are very important in terms of helping students access content. So, like many of you said, literacy requires language, and that oral language, or listening and speaking, is really important as we're then using that to leverage this thing of written language, reading and writing. Now, what I want to say is this isn't just early in the learning process for reading and writing. Leveraging oral language is often an important element of helping then translate or transition into written language. I do this often, right? I get an idea in my head and I want to talk to somebody about it. Sometimes it's just my dog and he doesn't always respond well, but at least I'm using my speaking abilities to sort of leverage that. Before I actually do some writing about something, I often do some conversation, some discussion. It's a great strategy to help people understand, think aloud, try out their thoughts and their ideas. And so remember, both of these elements, oral language and written language, are really critical. So why am I giving you all of this information? Well, one, language is at the center of a learning process. Humans learn through language, and they learn through all modes of language: speaking, listening, reading, and writing. Language is a way of seeing and understanding and communicating about the world. And learning in schools and classroom is largely accomplished through language. I see in the chat somebody wrote here, you can think without writing, but you can't write without thinking. I love that. I love that comment. This idea that when we think about sitting in school, maybe it's you sitting in school, sitting in a classroom right now in higher ed, maybe you're pursuing an advanced degree. Your learning is accomplished through language, through how you can speak, how you can listen, how you can read, and how you can write. Now, remember, half of those things must be taught. We're going to get to that. Academic language, the language of school. Okay, so we've seen this slide 3 times now. This time we're going to use it to talk about how the language of school is different from everyday language, right? And so when we talk and when we speak in the school environment, we're using a different kind of language in order to communicate ideas. Think about if we're teaching math, if we're teaching science, if we're teaching history, if we're teaching English language arts, if we're teaching physical education, right? There is a particular language that we're using there. We're using it both in the oral environment. So as a teacher, you may be speaking it, and students are expected to listen and to understand that. And not all students come to school with the same level of academic language. And then there's the written language, right? The reading and writing. And when we think about the academic language in different content areas, whether it's English language arts or math or history or science, there is a different kind of written language that students must, that they have to sort of interact with to be successful in that learning environment. So academic language serves a very practical function in schools. It helps students access and comprehend complex content. It will help them communicate their ideas and engage with those educational materials across different subjects. So when you think about academic language, and we're going to focus on these words that are actually in orange, academic language is really critical for students in the schooling process, because if you think about how they can access and comprehend that content, if they don't have access to that language, they won't be able to comprehend it. They have to use what they know to effectively communicate their ideas. And it's really important that they have a handle on academic language to engage with those educational materials. So let's do a little example, because I feel like we've been talking a little bit high level and you're like, well, what do you exactly mean by academic language? So I'm going to show you an example. And this is if, let's say that I had just done a little bit of research, conducted a research study, and I was telling people about it. And I'm going to tell people about it in 2 different ways. The first example that I'm going to show you is, pretend I'm at a dinner party, talking with friends, out with a friend for coffee. I might say something like this to explain the research that I just did. I might say, Well, so basically, I wanted to see how kids in kindergarten grew their language when they were part of a program that teaches them about big connected topics, stuff that builds their knowledge and vocabulary over time. I tracked their progress during lessons to see if the program actually helped their language grow. And I also wanted to know if it worked the same way for different types of kids. So, this might be a way that I would share with somebody in an oral social environment about the kind of research that I did. Well, if I had to write that down as sort of the introduction to this research study in a written form, it might look a little something like this. This study examined how academic oral language development unfolds as kindergarten students participate in a knowledge building curriculum that provides exposure to coherent topics designed to grow their academic knowledge and vocabulary. Whew, I'm going to stop there because by now you probably are all sleeping, right? Do you see how long that sentence was? That was just one sentence packed with all kind of vocabulary that maybe some people don't understand because they don't have the background information, or they don't read academic journals. And so this is a great example, although it's not exactly a kindergarten example, but this is a great example of how we use language differently in different contexts, and how oral language is much less complex than written academic language. And it's exactly this academic language side of the house that we want to prepare students for. And obviously, we don't do that uh, only in kindergarten, right? But we start developing that in the early grades so that over time they are better able to participate in content area discussions. We're helping them develop their concepts. We're helping them communicate those concepts in ways that involve reading and writing. Oh man, that was probably really boring for you. Sorry about that. So, academic language then refers to this specialized language used in educational settings. I'm going to go back one slide. This specialized language in the academic language side is very specific to education research, right? But if you think about specialized language in, let's say, mathematics, that's a specialized language that needs some instruction. Um, and this idea that it's used in educational settings. It sometimes poses such a significant challenge for students because they have maybe never been exposed to some of this language prior to coming to school. Some kids are, right? Like some kids have parents that talk about these things at home, or have been to a museum and have learned about scientific concepts. But many kids don't, and most kids don't have the range of educational opportunities that they're going to need to have to be successful in later grades of schooling. I love this quote. So, we've talked about how our capacity for language develops naturally, but no one is a native speaker of academic English. Now, you can be in academic situations where you can hear the language being used around you, but that assumes you're in those academic conversations. And so we must leverage language development as a more naturally developing process to then get kids to understand these important academic concepts that they're encountering in the schooling environment. And even though vocabulary is not the only element of academic language, it is critical, and many students aren't exposed to this academic vocabulary until they enter school. Now, I see in the chat somebody said background knowledge is huge. Background knowledge is huge. And often we use vocabulary as a proxy for the knowledge that you know. So if you think about this, if you know a lot about a topic, then you know a lot of vocabulary associated with that topic. You can often be very flexible in your vocabulary usage in that topic, and you can get much more precise about how you communicate ideas within that topic because you have a broad range of vocabulary. And so, even though it's not the only element of academic knowledge, actually, it's only one little bit, it does serve as really an important proxy for other areas. So, why does this even matter? What is the functions that we have of academic language, and why is it really important to help students have access to this and develop this? Well, for three reasons, and these are interrelated functions, so don't think of them in isolation. We're going to talk about how they work together. The first one is giving kids academic language helps them describe complex ideas and relationships. So if somebody asked me to explain gravity, I'd be like, meh, I don't know. I kind of have an idea of what it is in my head, like I drop the ball off the table and it goes down to the floor. Drop my coffee cup onto the floor. It's going to drop because of gravity. But I can't really express much more than that. If you know about this idea of gravity, you are better able to describe those ideas and how gravity is related to other things. This is really important, and it's not just in complex concepts such as gravity. You think about it in mathematics, or you even think about it in English language arts as we're talking about characters in a story, a setting in a story, right? There are some complex ideas and relationships that academic language can help support. Academic language also helps with complex thinking processes. We talk about higher order thinking and how important it is to get kids up to, Bloom's taxonomy, the top of the pyramid, right? Where we're evaluating ideas and being critical thinkers about ideas. You can't just introduce a topic to a kid or even an adult if they have never heard about it before and expect them to get to that higher order thinking. We have to scaffold them into higher order thinking. You can't do higher order thinking about complex ideas and relationships that you don't know anything about, right? So if somebody asked me to do some higher order thinking, some evaluation, some comparison about gravity and something else, I'd be at a loss because I don't have the depth of knowledge. But if I do have the depth of knowledge, and that academic language will help me then describe those complex thinking processes. So it's not just about ideas and relationships, it's about how we're thinking about those ideas and relationships. And this is really important because, as you can hear, I've been talking about concepts that are rather abstract, right? It's not like a concept of a coffee mug, a thing that we name. It's abstract ideas, gravity, the idea of friendship, right? Like there's all kind of abstract concepts that we ask students to engage in terms of thinking about ideas and relationships and higher order. Abstract concepts are really hard. Oh, that's a really good one. Kindness was a good one somebody put in the chat. So abstract ideas are really tough, and we need to help kids have access to the academic language. Now, remember, academic language is related to a content area, but can also be related to a concept. All right. So we've got the functions. So going back again, why do we want students to develop this academic language? We really want them to be deep thinkers about things that are hard to describe and understand. And academic language helps us facilitate that sort of communication. Dimensions. Wow, I realize that this is a lot of information. I hope you're finding this helpful. When we think about the dimensions of academic language, we're going to think about three different layers of that language. So first of all is the structure or the discourse, like how is this information organized? And it doesn't matter if it's in print or if it's in speech. The overall structure, you think about a text type or a genre. Remember, we were talking about written language, and written language, academic language uses headings and images and sometimes graphs or photographs. And the overall text structure of that is really important. You don't organize a narrative text the same way you organize an informational text that's maybe in a textbook, right? So it's really important that we understand the structure of how information is organized, and we help students understand that structure. And again, You don't have to be an English language arts teacher to help them with that. If you are a science teacher and you are helping them read or write lab reports, for example, helping them understand how to organize that information and communicate that information in your particular content area is really important. Sentences and syntax. Man, I don't know how many times I've said this in the last 2 years, but I think the sentences and syntax don't get the stage they deserve. Sentences are constructed to communicate some meaning by the author that writes them. And again, depending on the content area you're in, depending on what the author wants to communicate, sentence construction is differently. How I write a sentence in mathematics, a mathematical sentence, is very different than how I write poetry. Oh, I can't write poetry. How poetry is written, which is also very different than narrative text or a text you might see related to something from history. And so sentence level construction is really important for kids to understand and for kids to unpack. So fun challenge for you. The next time you're teaching kids something and it's written in a sentence, whether that's a sentence from English or sentence from math, think about how a particular sentence is constructed and how it's trying to communicate meaning. I've often heard writers say that, writers don't stress over the overall structure of what they're writing, because if you're going to communicate something, you typically have an idea of the way that you're going to structure that text, right? So if I'm writing an email, I know how I'm going to structure that text. If I'm going to write an informational paragraph, I know how I'm going to structure that text. What we sweat about is how to get the sentences right. How do I get this idea into a sentence in such a way that the reader, the person I'm communicating to, is going to understand my meaning? And how do I build those sentences together in a way that makes the text cohesive, whether it's short or whether it's long? And so really important to think about the sentence level and syntax. Academic language is much more complex. And so sentence construction by nature is much more complex, and we need to help students understand how that works in written text and then how they can also use that in their own writing. And then there's the word level. Here's the vocabulary, the terminology, the phrases that are used in particular academic context, and the nuances of the meanings of some of those words. So remember how I said, if you have knowledge of a topic, and the deeper knowledge you have about that topic, the more knowledge you have about the vocabulary of that topic, and the more able you are to use the nuances of vocabulary to communicate just the right thing, right? Picking that just right word. But the same thing happens when you're reading text. The more you know about the topic of a text you're reading, the better you're going to be able to comprehend that, and the better you're going to be able to understand the nuances of meaning that the author used when they picked that particular word. And so when we think about academic language and how much more complex it is, how it's used specifically in different disciplines, we have to pay attention to word level, sentence level, and overall structure. And we can't leave out one or the other. All are important. Okay. True or false? In the chat, write T or F. Language is all about communication, so language only involves spoken or written words. I love it. Lots of falses. False, 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 false. Thank you for that, because it actually is false. If you've never read this book, The Language Instinct, I really encourage you to read it. It is amazing. It took me a little bit to get through the first time, but I absolutely loved it. And long story, my dad recently had a stroke. I guess it's been a couple of years. It left him with the inability to actually communicate verbally, so he can't speak and he actually can't write either. But this idea of mentalese is we use language to communicate our thoughts, but the underlying process of thinking is a more abstract system. And so I see this in my dad, where he was an engineer, lots of patents with IBM. He knows a lot. He knows a lot about very specialized topics, and he used to talk about it a lot. He can't now, but I know when we ask him questions or talk with him, you can sort of see his wheels turning. Or when you talk with kindergartners or first graders, right? And you ask them a question, and they maybe might not have the words to be able to communicate what they're thinking, but you know there's stuff in their head. There's these abstract thoughts that they just can't get out. And this is the important reason for us to give kids that mechanism of complete academic language so they can then make these thoughts and ideas more transparent. It's Scarborough's rope again, right? Helping them have this knowledge, the vocabulary associated with that knowledge, how then this academic language works within texts, how to think about what we're reading about and writing about, right? So academic language involves this idea of academic thinking, and that supports the essential literacy skills across all domains. Remember, all domains: speaking, listening, reading, and writing. Now, one thing that I want to say is that if we don't pay attention to this idea of word recognition, if we can't get kids automatic at reading and writing words, we keep them back from expanding their academic language. Let's unpack that a little bit here. So, access to academic language. Cunningham and Stanovich, I know this is old, 1998, but it's a great aha moment that the bulk of vocabulary growth during a child's lifetime occurs indirectly through language exposure rather than through direct teaching. Now, hold on. That doesn't mean we shouldn't be explicitly and systematically teaching kids things we should be, right? We have to do that with word recognition to ensure they're readers. We have to do that with complex content when we're talking about mathematics or science or history, whatever it is. We have to do some direct teaching. However, if we relied on just that teaching for students to learn all of the things that they need to learn across their lifetime, it would never happen. And so this article really unpacks this idea that, first of all, we've got to get kids automatic in word recognition. That's the job of early reading teachers. And the reason for that is because the earlier we do that, the more kids are in print and reading. And what we see is that with kids that are really proficient readers, their vocabulary growth starts to skyrocket because they spend more time in text. And kids that are struggling with reading a little bit will tend not to spend as much time in text. And so this vocabulary growth ends up doing something like this, right? This is really, really, really important. Somebody is asking for a link to this article. Actually, it is, we can get that to you. I apologize. But if you Google Cunningham and Stanovich 1998, the article should pop up. It's in the American Educator. And you should be able to get to that. Oof, next time I'll make sure I have that handy. I apologize. So this is why this framework is so important, because if we don't get students access to this, they're never going to develop as academic thinkers. Remember this idea of oral language that develops naturally, this written language that must be taught, how written language is more formal and complex. And by the way, that means by design that it used more vocabulary. This comes from the same article. The large differences in lexical richness. Oh my gosh, think about those two words. Talk about complex concepts. Lexical richness. Basically, that means the words are so rich on the page, right? And the differences between speech and print are a major source of individual differences in vocabulary development, and the differences are created by the large variability among children in exposure to literacy. Literacy, the reading and writing element of that. Again, what I said is when kids learn how to read early and they become proficient and automatic early, their exposure to vocabulary and concepts grows so much because they have eyes on print. So what can we do to actually support that academic language development? There's a lot of bullet points here. And what I'd like you to think about is no matter what content area you teach, I'm assuming most of you are ELA. Oh, Lauren Brenner, if you see the chat, Lauren Brenner found that article for us. Please grab that article. It is rich and full of great information. Thank you, Lauren, for doing that. Okay, back to supporting academic language development. First of all, you notice the first bullet point, explicitly teach word recognition skills with adequate practice to develop automaticity. That means that in the early grades, if we don't have automatic word recognition, and that doesn't mean memorizing words, that means kids are actually learning sound spelling patterns. They're practicing that with reading and writing words. We call this the cognitive process of orthographic mapping, which, by the way, if you're a podcast listener, we're going to do an episode on that early in season 10. This is your gateway. Word recognition skills, both for reading and writing, is your gateway into all academic language. It doesn't matter if it's ELA, math, science, history. It's the gateway into better literacy and academic language. So that's important. Number 2, you need to intentionally build students' knowledge and vocabulary in these academic topics. What do I mean by intentionally build? You know, we're not going to give them a tiny bit of information today about a topic, and then tomorrow we'll talk about something else, and the next day we'll talk about something else. What we need to do is, in order to build knowledge, and you know this for yourself, anytime you're trying to learn something new, it's hard, and you need to do a day by day by day by day, right? Like students should be embedded in a concept for a couple, 2 to 3 weeks, right? And the point there is not the 2 to 3 weeks. The point there is that you need to give them enough instruction and exposure and practice thinking and talking and reading and writing about this topic that they start to build up and build up and build up. I sort of think about it like a rubber band ball. You know what I'm talking about, right? You start with a couple of rubber bands that you sort of wad up together, and then you wrap rubber bands around and around and around and around. And so if you stop before you get a strength of that rubber band ball, it's going to all fall apart. But what you want to do is you want to continue to build that up. And you want to make sure you're teaching vocabulary in that context of the content that you're teaching. Vocabulary in isolation is ridiculous. It doesn't work. Everybody knows that. You can't memorize a list of words and then think that you have a rich vocabulary. Vocabulary serves as a proxy for knowledge. So you need to build that knowledge and then build that vocabulary alongside it. And that allows students to better understand concepts and understand them more flexibly. Number 4, you must leverage oral language. You must. It doesn't matter if you're a kindergarten kid or if you're an adult learner. Leveraging oral language will help support written language. And by what I mean by that, it helps support your reading comprehension and your ability to write about those topics. And the interplay between reading and writing is so important, right? Writing is the hardest thing we do, but you have to leverage oral language to be able to support that writing. It's a great learning opportunity. Next one. I've said it a few times, integrate all modes of language into all subject areas. No matter what you're trying to learn, you need to listen to it, you need to talk about it, you need to read about it, and you need to write about it. I'm going to use a very personal example here. I decided that I wanted to learn Spanish. And so I think I'm using Duolingo, and I think I'm day 103 of learning Spanish. Here's the thing. I found out, though, that there were times that I actually had to get a notebook out and I had to put pen to paper. Luckily, I know a lot about language development. I had to put pen to paper to help me with some of the vocabulary words and some of the syntax that I needed to learn, because I found that just doing it on an app on my phone wasn't giving me what I needed to have. And so I made sure that I brought in that writing element of it, along with the listening and speaking and reading, obviously, to integrate those modes of language to help me learn. Remember that even if you're a math teacher, you should be leveraging speaking, listening, reading, and writing. Those modes of language are not exclusive to English language arts, right? They're the way that we learn. Next, you need to model and encourage curiosity. You know, we don't want kids to develop academic language and knowledge just for fun of it, right? Like, there is actually a way that we can build curiosity, and that's what we want, is we want to develop lifelong learning. You know, that's the great thing about language, is that as long as you are a lifelong learner, your language will continue to develop. Anytime you learn something new, anytime you hear vocabulary in a different context, you learn something new. And so, again, as long as you are a lifelong learner, you will continue to develop that language. And the last thing is that you really need to make sure you're attending to all of those dimensions. Words in the context of the content you are teaching, sentences, how those words are put together to communicate the ideas that you're teaching, and then this idea then of much larger texts. So my challenge to you, my call to action to you, is for you to really take a look either at your owner instruction, the instruction that's happening in your building, or it could be, like me, something that you're learning about, and challenge yourself to make some changes that will strengthen your students' academic language. If we go back to this list, think about how many of these you're incorporating into the way that you're teaching. Whether that be at the lesson level or the overall unit level. Are there some changes you can make, maybe small changes, and see what kind of impact it actually has on students in your classroom and how they talk about the topics they're learning about, how they read about the topics they're learning about, and how they write about it. And I'll close with this quote, which is, "The limits of my language are the limits of my world. And when it comes to language, the sky is really the limit." So thank you so much for joining. And I think I'm going to turn it over to Lauren, who has some closing slides.
All right. Wow. Welcome. Wow. Thank you so much, Susan. That was incredible. What an insightful presentation, and what a wonderful quote to end on. I think everyone found your presentation so invaluable, and certainly with lots of takeaways to take back to beginning of the school year, or if you're already in school, back to your classroom. And once again, thank you for our attendees for joining us today. We're so glad that you could be here. And before we hop off, I want to invite everyone to our upcoming Science of Reading webinar week to continue your professional learning with us. We have 5 one-hour-long webinars taking place the week of September 29th through October 3rd. And we'll actually have our very own Susan kicking us off for the week of learning as we dive into reading comprehension, what it is and isn't, how comprehension and knowledge building are connected, and so much more. So register to join us at amplify.com/fall SOR webinars, and we'll also drop that link in the chat. So join for one webinar, join for all 5. We'd love to have you to continue the learning and the conversation. And thank you so much again, Susan, for this wonderful presentation. And thank you again to all of you attendees for joining us today. Have a great rest of your day.